Paul packed his bag and left for class. It has been a week since he had the awkward conversation with his uncle's wife. Everything seemed to remind him about it. The writings on the book covers, the headlines of certain posters, radio broadcasts, everything pointed towards the pain of marrying wrong. "I am sure you are still wondering why I refused to let your sister live here," she has said to him. "Well, I am married to a man that is drawn to anything in skirts, regardless of age and status." She went on and on. She gave him details that left him uncomfortable. She pleaded with him to help her out. "Your uncle will be back from his business trip next week," she had said to him. She explained how careful her husband had been around her since her suspicion aroused, and asked Paul to access his uncle's phone. "Take pictures of chats or anything that will serve as concrete evidence. I want a divorce." Paul had doubts about her accusations. For the little time he got to relate with his uncle, the man seemed to be very religious and of good morals. He was also a dedicated businessman. "I'm sure he's too busy for things like that," Paul muttered to himself. He shrugged and walked into the lecture room. The lecturer walked in a moment later. He wrote Basics of Psychology boldly on the whiteboard and turned his face to the class. He yapped about things, gave references to handouts, didn't bother about taking notes, and left the class. In less than 30 minutes, the lecture was over. Paul took out his phone and began to browse more on the topic, but got distracted by some gossipers at the window side. Their voice grew louder and they argued further. Paul had to pack up things to leave. If there was anything he needed, it was a peaceful place to study. Just then, a guy of his age walked up to him with a sheet containing the contact information of some students. "Why are you giving me this?" Paul asked, puzzled. "I am the course rep. Put down your name and phone number here," the guy said. "Oh," Paul quickly wrote on the sheet. "You didn't know I'm the course rep?" the guy asked Paul. Paul shook his head and gave a half smile. "You barely socialize, do you?" he asked again. This time Paul raised his palm as if to say, "Na so we see amo." The guy chuckled and extended his hand for a shake. "My name is Paul," he said. "Paul? My name is Paul too," Paul exclaimed. There and then a friendly, lengthy conversation began. Paul felt his mind relieved of most burdened thoughts. Maybe what he needed was to socialize after all. On getting home later in the evening, Paul was surprised to find his uncle home. "I told my wife I'll be back next week, but I arrived early to surprise her," his uncle said, grinning from ear to ear. He asked Paul how he had been doing and urged him to unpack with him. "I bought foodstuff and very nice snacks on my way back. I'm sure my wife will be pleased," his uncle continued. Paul began to wonder, how can such a sweet husband be a cheat? Paul observed his smile. It indeed looked genuine. His uncle's phone buzzed. Paul gazed at it. It was a call from the mechanic. His uncle quickly took the phone and asked if there was anything wrong with their generator. "No," Paul replied, not taking the startled look on his uncle's face seriously. "Oga, we don't need mechanical services." His uncle backed into the speaker as he cut the call. Paul took a second glance at him. Seeing the sweat that formed at the man's forehead, he paused what he was doing. "Today's stress, eh?" his uncle said with a sigh. He tossed his phone on the sofa nonchalantly and left the living room to shower. Paul continued what he was doing, but the call came again. After ignoring it for the third time, Paul finally picked the call. "So this is it, eh? You traveled to ignore me, eh?" a female voice back from the other end. Paul looked again at the phone screen to confirm if it was still the contact saved as mechanic, then placed the phone on his ear again. "And take responsibility for the creature in my womb. You can't dump me, dumbhead," the woman continued. Paul gasped. It all became clear to him. It had been hard to believe all this while. So his uncle did not arrive home earlier than scheduled to surprise his wife, but to avoid the chaos he had caused. His uncle was indeed having an affair. "I thought these things only happen in movies," Paul muttered aloud, his heart filled with pity for his uncle's wife. The woman on the call seemed to notice that she had been speaking to someone else as she gasped and cut the call. Paul heard his uncle's footsteps. He kept the phone back on the sofa and pretended that nothing had happened. Just then, there was a knock on the door. His uncle's wife had just gotten back from work. Paul stood to greet her. She smiled, walking towards him. But when Paul's uncle walked in, She completely ignored Paul and turned to her husband. For that moment, the man and wife seemed like they were very lovable couples. They chatted excitedly and walked hand in hand to their bedroom. Paul scoffed. The drama was really something else. A cheating husband and a wife harboring grudges, pretending to be completely in love. It was at that moment Paul realized he couldn't trust either of them. He began to worry about his sister, wondering if she was actually doing fine as his aunt claimed. The next morning, as soon as he woke up from sleep, the door creaked open and his uncle's wife stepped into his room. She was still wearing her night dress. There was a smile on her face, somewhat odd. It just didn't feel right. "Good morning, Paul," she said, sitting on the table beside him. Paul was still lying, feeling sleepy. She leaned closer to him. Her coily hair fell to neck length, and the loose part of her dress fell forward, revealing her bare chest. Paul was fully awake by then. He screamed and rolled out of bed. "You went to bed without dinner. I am just checking if you are sick," his wife said with a playful frown. Sorry," Paul stammered. "Naughty boy," she said, smiled and gestured him to come back to bed. Paul moved further away from her instead. "I have a favor to ask you," Paul said, looking down at his feet. "I want to visit my sister. Give me the location to her guardian's house," he continued without hesitation. "Paul, she's doing fine." Paul frowned. He walked towards the door, opened it, and gestured her to leave. "I'm tired," he lied. Without a word, she left. Paul sighed. Was I imagining things? Was she just flirting with me? Paul asked himself after closing the door. He thought things through. His sister was definitely not doing fine, else he wouldn't be denied access to her. There was no one to complain to, especially not his uncle. After a while, a thought struck him. He took his phone from his wardrobe and dialed a familiar contact. "Hello, Yabo." "Paulo!" Yabo exclaimed joyously from the other end.